Good morning and welcome to Sunday School with Murph and the beginning of fall, right? And we all know the seasons change when my backdrop does. No, seriously though, it's brand new, and if you can tell, this is probably the biggest one. It's an official fall backdrop, obviously. The one I was using before was my first one that was a little bit smaller. Was more of a summer kind of a foresty morning thing, but this is cool. I like this, and it just adds something. I like, I try to make sure I wear a different color shirt, and at least rotate through my colors so that not every single day has the same look. So it's easier to tell which videos you've watched and haven't watched. But just little things to try and improve quality of what we're doing here, which none of that matters as long as the Word of God is properly taught and we all learn something from it. So we're still doing salvation typology. We're going to continue on with the life of Moses, but before we get in there, prayer request, be praying for Roscoe. He's dealing with some issues, health issues. Continue to pray for Ron Knight and in his cancer battle. My mother, her cancer battle. Continue to be in prayer for the Tommy Dennis family. His memorial service will be this Thursday coming up. I worked with him for a couple of years at Dirt Plant a while back. Really great guy. Definitely will be missed. But as I said the other day, it's a celebration in heaven for him being there. So cannot wait to see him again. Next Saturday, we've got a men's ministry. I call it the Dogwood Dash. We're going to build little like Pinewood Derby car things and race them down a ramp. Bring kids, grandkids, boys and girls, doesn't matter. Bring, if you got kids. If not, come anyways. Build a car, have a hot dog or a hamburger, and have some fellowship with some other men, and let's see what we can do about building up men and encouraging men to spend time with their children and grandchildren. So that's next Saturday at 9 a.m. We will start, build the cars, have lunch, race them, and then do a little awards thing after that with a short message from the Bible and have some good fellowship. So,
Sorry.
careful with the table. Need to get like a heavy oak table that won't shake as much as this. Anyways, all right. So continue on with the life of Moses, part 2. We left off last week. In Exodus chapter 2, and he had killed the Egyptian guard. The Israelites rejected him. Word got back to Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't happy that he killed the guard, so he was going to deal with Moses, and Moses turned around and ran. Ended up in the land of Midian, which is just somewhere north of Ethiopia. It's not exactly Ethiopia, but that's probably the closest nation today to where he ended up. And it's that Horn of Africa, as you go kind of southeast from Egypt in that direction. And that's where he ended up in Midian. He was able to help the Midianite priests' daughters, was able to help them water their flocks, protect them from the other shepherds that they were competing for the same well. And so he brought a type of salvation to them. And he spent the next 40 years living in Midian. This priest guy, Rule, whose daughters specifically that Moses helped, gave him a wife. He had 2 sons. And so we pick back up with Moses. Let's see here. before we get to that, we get Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So, like I said last week, the pharaohs and everybody that remembered what Joseph had done for the land of Egypt were basically all dead. And so the current pharaoh didn't remember those things, didn't really care. He probably had somebody whisper in his ear that you need to do something about those Israelites because there's like millions of them now and they outnumber us. They're going to be a problem. And he may have thought that on his own. Who knows? And so he began to actually really truly enslave them and punish them and treat them more and more harshly. That's why that guard was beaten up on the Israelites when Moses intervened. And there's a possibility here that the treatment got worse because Moses had killed the guard and ran away. And I mean, it doesn't say that in the text, so I don't think that that's exactly what was going on. We really don't know. But, I'm sure that probably played into it with Moses killing that guard and running away. So we get to Exodus chapter 3, and this is when, after Moses has been in Midian for 40 years, he was happy and content to be there. All he had to do was he was a shepherd, and that was it. It was all good. It was all fine and comfortable and dandy. He had his wife, had a couple of kids. It was all good. So in Exodus chapter 3, after the Israelites began to cry out and began to turn back to God and turn to God for salvation from their situation there in Egypt, Moses is out doing his thing, and he goes up on the mountain and he encounters the burning bush, and God speaks to him through this bush. And the bush is on fire, but is not consumed, right? So this is the Spirit of God. And of course, we see that further on in the Exodus when the children of Israel are wandering around in the desert, and God is a pillar of smoke by day and fire by night, right? But that's when Moses is called to be the one that's going to go down and bring salvation to the people of Israel, bring them out of Egypt. And so this is, like I said, we kind of have this pattern with these things we look for when we're talking about this salvation typology. And you have some sort of persecution, you have exile, you have rejection. And Moses has been in quote-unquote exile now for like 40 years because he was rejected by the Israelites. And so now it's time for the exile period to be over and for Moses to go back into Egypt. And he's called from the burning bush. So then you get to Exodus chapter 4. And Moses is given powerful signs, 3 specifically. But the reason he's given these signs is for him to prove that he is of God and has the power of God and speaks for God. And this is in the same way that Christ performed miracles. And he performed miracles to fulfill prophecy, but to also prove that he was the Messiah. He had to prove he was sent by God for the salvation of people. And Moses specifically, though, is told to go before Pharaoh, and God gives him these powerful signs, one of them being that he throws his staff on the ground and it turns into a serpent. And the Egyptian magicians were able to do the same thing, but then Moses' staff eats his serpent eats their serpent, right? So, the one true God is more powerful than your puny little false gods and demonic whatevers. The second sign he's given is that puts his hand in his cloak and he pulls it out and it's covered with disease. Could have been leprosy, could have been whatever. He sticks it back in his cloak, pulls it back out, it's healed. So the one true God that sent Moses has the ability to actually heal people, physically. It's not something imaginary. It's not something. We're going to see that when I go over the plagues here in just a moment too. And then the third sign that Moses is given to prove he's from God is being able to turn the water, the Nile River, or water in general, into blood, which again will show up in the plagues. And so as Moses comes back, Pharaoh hardened his own heart even before God hardened it even further, which had to be done. And so Pharaoh begins to punish the Israelites even more than what they were already doing. They were making bricks, and now they had to go out, and instead of all the materials being brought to them to make the bricks, the straw, the clay, the whatever else they were using, they now had to go out and gather their own straw plus make the bricks. And it's just that much more work for them. It's that much more difficult, and not as much rest. So it's getting much harder for them. And again, Moses keeps going back to Pharaoh, and every time he goes to Pharaoh, it gets worse for the Israelites. And there's a reason for that. You get to Exodus chapter 6, and verse 1 says, "But the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." Hopefully, if you've ever gotten any good teaching, Egypt is representative of sin as a whole. Now, I mean, it's a safe place Abraham spent time in Egypt as a place of refuge in his travels. Obviously, Joseph got them into Egypt to save them from the famine and to preserve the bloodline and to preserve the remnant. And so Egypt can be this place of safety, but if you stay too long, then it becomes a place of sin, and it becomes a place where you're too comfortable. You're not doing the things God wants you to do. And again, Egypt was not and is not the promised land. Canaan is the promised land. So you have to get to Canaan. And so just like we're here on this earth for a time, it's a comfortable place to be, but this is not our permanent destination. We want to all get to heaven. And so God wants the Israelites to get to the land of Canaan. And it takes 400 years, and you actually will find this, and I should have looked this up. I just thought about this. But, people ask the question, why were the Israelites in Egypt for 400 years? And God had to give time for the Canaanites to actually build up enough sin that they were true enemies of God to be worth driving out of the land. Exactly whatever that looked like, whether it was physically driving them out or God running them out or the Israelites coming in and defeating them, whatever it looked like. But they had a period of time where their sin had to increase. There's more to that, but I don't have time to get into all that. But that's why they stayed in Egypt for 400 years. That's why it took that long for God to bring them out of Egypt. And that's mentioned either by a prophet or somebody somewhere else. But I'll look that up, maybe put that in the notes. But again, Exodus chapter 6 is the part where we start getting into why and how God's going to do, how he's going to bring about the salvation of the Israelites. And the plagues themselves start up in Exodus chapter 7. Now, this is not really part of the typology other than to say this is the power of God and how he's greater than their false gods. And this is one of the signs that was given to Moses when he confronted Pharaoh initially, but one of the first plagues put upon the Egyptians was that Moses turned the Nile River into blood. Well, all of the 10 plagues are actually judgments against the false gods of Egypt. And so the first one, turning the Nile into blood, is a judgment against the god Osiris, whom they believed that the Nile River was his blood. Water brings life, blood brings life. So if you can control that, then you control life. And they actually thought that every year when the Nile River would flood, and we get that season you get a rainy season every year, and there's a period of time when the river itself would flood and expand its banks. They thought that was like the rebirth of Osiris every year. So here's God saying, this is your false god Osiris, and I'm turning the water into blood. And of course, nothing can live in blood. Now, we have to have blood in us to live. But if you're in blood, the fish died. It says that specifically. All the fish and the creatures in the Nile that they would eat died. So it could no longer provide life to Egypt. You can't water plants with blood. It's not water. So that was the first one. The second plague was a plague of frogs. And they actually had a fertility goddess named Heket who had the head of a frog. Why, I don't know. But a fertility goddess, and if you've ever been to some foreign country, like when I was in Japan, you could find like these fertility temples or these gardens where they had a bunch of weird phallic symbols, and women would go and do little ceremony things, asking whatever, the universe or something, to help them get pregnant and have children. It's a weird thing. You see that a lot within Buddhism and some of these other false religions. And according to the Egyptians, this frog goddess, Heket, was the one who could help you get pregnant so you have children. And of course, that was a big deal thousands of years ago, because you need to have a large family for protection, to be able to work your land, to go out and hunt for food. You wanted a large family. Plus, some children died at a greater rate back then, so you needed to make sure you had children to replace the ones that died. So the whole fertility thing was a big deal. They actually had more than one god and goddess of fertility. All right, but the third plague was gnats. And this was a direct judgment on their god Set, who was god of the desert. And essentially this god was, I guess, supposed to be able to control gnats or something. And so here's God himself going, here's a bunch of gnats, you couldn't do it. Set was also god of the underworld. And so when things are rotting and nasty, what do they do? And rotting and getting nasty, it attracts gnats and flies and that sort of thing. So stuff goes out in the desert and dies, and about the only thing that can go out there and deal with it is gnats. Potentially. Let's see here. The fourth one, Exodus chapter 8, the fourth plague is flies. And this is the fun one to pronounce. Uatchit. Uatchit. Was the fly god. Something to do with death, whatever. Flies come around dead flesh and dying vegetables and plants and that sort of thing. So again, God can control their gods. I don't know why they would have a god. I mean, was that horror movie, The Fly? Wow. Yeah, so they had stuff like that carved on their walls. It was weird. Let's see here. The fifth fifth. That was the fourth was flies. The fifth was when all the livestock died in the fifth plague, and that was a judgment on two different gods, Hathor and Apis, both of whom were depicted as cattle. Now, they weren't like modern day Hindus who think that you are incarnated as a cow when you die, but they recognized that they ate cows and they sacrificed them, but they also understood that they thought these were given to them by God, right? So they had these gods and goddesses that were livestock, and here's God killing all of their livestock, all of their cattle, and so God is killing their gods. See here, then boils, Exodus chapter 9, when they got the boils and the sores on them, and it was a judgment against Sekhmet, Sunu, and Isis, which were all gods of healing. Now, some gods had multiple things that they could be applied to. Some gods were specific to just one thing. Isis is one of those gods that is not specific to one particular type of Egyptian life or part of Egyptian life, but they were all considered to be gods of healing. So if you got sick, you went and you appealed to Sekhet or Sunu or Isis, and they were supposed to heal you. Well, now here's the Egyptians running around with all these sores, and they couldn't be healed. Their false gods weren't able to heal them. Let's see here. Number 8 is hail. And again, multiple gods here. The god Nut, who was the sky god. Osiris, again, who was also a god of crops and fertility. And Set, who was god of the underworld and also was responsible for storms. And if you read in the scripture there, the hail destroyed all of their crops. And so hail came from the sky, so it would have been controlled by this Nut god. The crops are there, they got to eat, so that's a judgment against Osiris. And then Set would have been able to cause the storm, but here's God bringing in the storm himself and controlling everything and destroying all the crops and stuff. So again, another judgment on their false god. The plague of darkness, when everything was so pitch black that light couldn't even emit. So even if you had a candle, you still couldn't see anything. And that was a direct judgment against Ra, the sun god, who was also believed to be, the pharaoh was believed to be Ra incarnate or reincarnate. And so that was a direct hit on him. And then, of course, the firstborn children plague, the final plague that pushes Pharaoh to the point where he finally lets the Israelites go, is the death of the firstborn children, which is directly against Isis again, who was considered to be the protector of children. So if that God had been real, then God wouldn't have been able to go in and kill the firstborn. Every time that one of these plagues would come up, Moses would go back to Pharaoh, say, hey, you're going to let the Israelites go, let them out of Egypt? Well, sure, but they got to do this. Or he would try to sit there and put some condition, or he would say yes, and then he would change his mind. And his heart got hardened more and more every time. That's why it took 10 plagues. And they went after, they have more than 10 gods, but these were like the big ones. And so that leads us to Exodus chapter 12, where we institute the Passover. And the whole idea with the Passover, and God gave them specific instructions to sacrifice a lamb, put the lamb's blood upon your doorpost. You want a picture of salvation in the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 12 is your salvation in the Old Testament. They had to be ready to get up and run the next day. That morning, once everybody woke up and found all the firstborn children of Egypt were dead, they were going to be really ticked. and really upset, and Pharaoh was going to be really mad. And so the Israelites had to be ready to go. They couldn't take much with them, but they were able to carry actually a lot of the gold and a lot of so-called riches from Egypt. It's stuff that would eventually be used in the temple. But it was, they had to go out and pick out a lamb, and it had to have no blemishes. They began to put the lamb's blood upon the doorpost so that the death angel would pass by. And again, that's a judgment against their god of the underworld, against Set. I mean, obviously Isis is the protector of children, so it made her look bad. Showed her to be the false god that she was. But then Set as well, being god of the underworld and controller of death. And here's God himself dishing out death, right? But we still do the whole Passover thing today. Now, we do it through the Lord's Supper within the Protestant faith, but obviously that's when Easter happens. The whole Holy Week leading up to Christ's death and his crucifixion and his resurrection at Easter is directly from this moment here with Passover. And we use that same terminology and phraseology when we talk about salvation and how we need to have the blood of Christ covering us so that we are able to enter into heaven, to be in the presence of God. So then it's appointed unto man to die once, then the judgment. Well, then there's after here goes Facebook. We got 3 minutes left. Maybe we can make this. All right. So after it's appointed unto man to die once, then the judgment. After judgment, if you're sent to the lake of fire, it says this in Revelation, that's the second death. So if you have the blood of Christ applied to you, just as the Israelites had the blood of Christ on the blood of the Lamb on their doorposts, the death angel passed by and they were spared that other death. So they were able to pass on into eventually the promised land. And so that's the big picture here. But that's the second part of Moses' life, and we'll get into the 40 years in the wilderness next week and finish up with Moses. And then we'll talk about the illegitimate child of King David, which will be an interesting little study. But so the Passover, again, that's something we constantly bring up, constantly talk about. The Seder meals are the Passover meals, and the lamb and the bitter herbs, and all of that is prescribed back here in the book of Exodus, given through Moses to the Israelites for them to be able to leave that temporary world of sin and enter into the land of promise. So we'll pick up at Exodus chapter 13 and cover the rest of Moses' life and their time wandering around in the desert next week. Again, be in prayer for Ron, Jane, them deal with their cancers. Be in prayer for the Knight family, the Dennis family. Knight family's Ron. But be in prayer for the Dennis family. Again, his memorial services come up this Thursday at 4:30 in the afternoon at Hepzibah Baptist Church. Be in prayer for, and come by if you want to make it to our Dogwood Dash next Saturday morning. Come on by, build a car, race it, eat some burgers, hear a little bit about God, and have some fun and fellowship. But if you can't do that, do your best to do what Christ told us to do, and that's to go out and make disciples. God bless. I will see you next time. Have a happy Sunday.